In the shadow of palm trees, neon lights, and the endless rhythm of Miami nightlife, another beat pulsed beneath the city's glamorous facade. It wasn't the sound of salsa clubs or the laughter of tourists. It was the crackle of gunfire, the roar of fast cars, the whispers of drug money exchanged in back alleys. By the late 1980s, Miami had earned a notorious nickname, cocaine capital of the world. And among the many crews that thrived in this turbulent underworld, one gang carved out its own ruthless identity. They called themselves the Miami Boys, a crew of young, heavily armed drug traffickers from Florida who spread terror across the American South. This is their story, how they rose from the cocaine wars of Miami, expanded into Atlanta, Alabama, and beyond, and how law enforcement finally dismantled them. The mid-1980s were a turning point in America's drug war. Crack cocaine had exploded across inner cities, offering quick highs and even quicker profits. Miami, already drenched in Colombian cocaine shipments, became a laboratory for this devastating new drug. In neighborhoods like Liberty City, Overtown, and Little Havana, young hustlers saw opportunity. Among them was a loose-knit group of young dealers, hitmen, and enforcers who began calling themselves the Miami Boys. Unlike traditional street gangs with deep neighborhood roots, the Miami Boys were more of a drug syndicate. They weren't bound by loyalty to a block or a housing project. They were bound by ambition and the promise of money. These young men had watched Colombian cartels flood the city with cocaine. They had seen the rise of flashy cocaine cowboys driving Ferraris and spraying machine guns in broad daylight. Now they wanted their piece of the empire. By the late 1980s, Atlanta was emerging as one of the South's fastest-growing cities. It was also becoming a lucrative hub for drug trafficking. The demand for crack was enormous, but the supply chain was fragmented. Small local dealers, mom-and-pop operations, loosely organized crews. The Miami Boys saw an opportunity. They flooded into Atlanta, bringing with them not only drugs, but a reputation for extreme violence. Armed with military-grade weapons, Uzis, MAC-10s, AK-47s, they muscled out local competition. Atlanta law enforcement quickly noticed the change. Shootings increased. Drug markets, once controlled by neighborhood figures, were suddenly overrun, and residents began to whisper about those boys from Miami. The Miami Boys operated with a kind of corporate ruthlessness. They brought structure, discipline, and efficiency to the crack trade. They had lieutenants, street-level dealers, and enforcers who ensured that anyone who challenged them paid a deadly price. Their takeover was swift, brutal, and effective. The late 1980s were a blood-soaked era for the American South. Crack was cheap, addictive, and devastating. Entire neighborhoods were consumed, and the Miami Boys were right in the center of it all. In Atlanta, Montgomery, Birmingham, and other southern cities, they ran open-air drug markets. They recruited local youth to sell crack, often paying them in either cash or product. And they enforced discipline with fear. Witnesses described drive-by shootings, execution-style killings, and brazen displays of firepower. Police raided crack houses, fortified with steel doors and surveillance systems. But the Miami Boys seemed untouchable. Part of their strength came from their connections back home in Miami. They had access to steady supplies of cocaine from Colombian and Bahamian smuggling routes. And they had the kind of street reputation that made most rivals back down without a fight. In many ways, the Miami Boys were pioneers, exporting Miami's brand of organized street-level drug dealing across the South. To understand the Miami Boys, one must understand Miami itself in the 1980s. The city was a powder keg. The infamous Mariel boat lift of 1980 had brought tens of thousands of Cuban refugees, including hardened criminals, to Florida's shores. Colombian cartels used Miami as their primary entry point for cocaine, turning the city into a battlefield of assassinations and drug wars. Young black men in Miami neighborhoods witnessed this chaos firsthand. The drug trade offered fast money in a city where poverty and inequality ran deep. The Miami boys were a product of this environment. They carried the swagger of the cocaine cowboys, but they weren't international smugglers. They were street-level entrepreneurs, carving out territory in America's crack economy. When they moved into new cities, they brought with them the lessons of Miami's underworld: intimidate rivals with overwhelming violence, control supply chains ruthlessly, and use fear to maintain order. By the early 1990s, the Miami boys had become a top priority for law enforcement in multiple states. In Atlanta, police formed specialized task forces to combat them. The FBI, DEA, and ATF all became involved, recognizing that this was not just a local gang problem, but an interstate drug network. Surveillance operations documented their movements. Undercover agents infiltrated crack houses. And prosecutors began stacking charges that included drug trafficking, racketeering, and murder. In 1990, Atlanta police made one of their largest crack seizures linked to the Miami boys, uncovering nearly $20 million worth of cocaine. Raids across Georgia and Alabama dismantled their operations piece by piece. But taking down the Miami boys wasn't easy. Their decentralized structure meant that even when leaders were arrested, others quickly took their place. Still, the pressure mounted. By the mid-1990s, the Miami boys were no longer the dominant force they once were. The decline of the Miami boys mirrored the decline of the crack epidemic itself. As law enforcement cracked down, as mandatory minimum sentences filled prisons, and as communities began to resist, the Miami boys lost ground. Many of their leaders were sentenced to long prison terms. Others were killed in shootouts or assassinations. And new gangs rose to fill the vacuum, most notably national organizations like the Bloods, Crips, and Gangster Disciples, who expanded across the South in the 1990s. By the 2000s, the Miami boys were no longer a major name in the underworld. They had become a memory, a cautionary tale of how quickly power can rise and how quickly it can collapse. The Miami boys left behind a complicated legacy. For many residents of Atlanta and other southern cities, they were remembered as a wave of terror that brought unprecedented violence to their neighborhoods. For historians of the drug war, they were an example of how drug markets evolve and spread, often faster than law enforcement can keep up. Their story reflects the larger tragedy of the crack era. Entire communities were destroyed, families torn apart. Prisons filled with young men caught in the cycle of addiction, poverty, and violence. The Miami boys were not the biggest gang of the crack era. They weren't the richest, but they were among the most influential, proving that a small, ruthless crew could change the face of a city. Today, their name lives on in court documents, police reports, and the memories of those who survived that violent time. In the end, the Miami boys were a symbol of a generation caught between poverty and opportunity, a generation that found power in the shadows and wealth in the destruction of others. Their story is not just about crime, it's about America in the 1980s and 1990s, about the war on drugs, about the choices people make when the system fails them, and about how violence always leaves a mark long after the money and the power have faded away. In the late 1980s, across the American South, neighborhoods were burning, not from fire, but from crack cocaine. And in the middle of it all was a violent, disciplined drug syndicate known only as the Miami Boys. Armed with Uzis, MAC-10s, and AK-47s, they carved out territory in cities like Atlanta, Birmingham, and Montgomery. But their fiercest battle wasn't just with rival dealers. It was against law enforcement itself. From 1988 to 1995, the streets of the South became a battleground, where local police, federal agents, and the Miami Boys engaged in what could only be described as urban warfare. This is the story of that war. The Miami Boys were not ordinary street hustlers. They were organized, mobile, and heavily armed. When they flooded into Atlanta in the late 1980s, they weren't content to blend into the city's existing drug scene. They seized control. Their open-air drug markets ran like military bases, lookouts on corners, runners delivering product, and enforcers ready to unleash violence at the first sign of trouble. Police officers in Atlanta began reporting something unusual. Drug crews weren't running from them anymore. They were standing and fighting back. 1988 marked the beginning of the Miami Boys' war with law enforcement. Task forces raiding crack houses in Atlanta and Montgomery often found themselves under heavy fire. One Atlanta police officer described it as like going into a war zone. The gang had fortified their drug houses with steel-plated doors and surveillance systems. By the time officers broke in, dealers were often already armed and waiting. Shootouts became common. Some raids ended with police injured, suspects dead, and whole communities caught in the crossfire. Law enforcement realized quickly this wasn't business as usual. The Miami Boys had turned drug dealing into combat. By the early 1990s, law enforcement had escalated its response. The DEA, FBI, and ATF launched joint investigations targeting Miami Boys' leadership. Cities like Atlanta and Birmingham created specialized narcotics task forces, often trained like paramilitary units. SWAT teams became a regular sight in inner-city neighborhoods, kicking down doors in pre-dawn raids. But the Miami Boys adapted. They developed counter-surveillance tactics. They used police scanners to monitor law enforcement movements, and they maintained multiple stash houses, ensuring that even if one was raided, the business would continue. Every time police struck, the Miami Boys struck back, with intimidation, with violence, and with sheer resilience. In 1990, Atlanta police scored their first major victory. After months of surveillance, they raided a Miami Boys safe house and uncovered nearly $20 million worth of cocaine. It was one of the largest drug seizures in the city's history. But if law enforcement thought this was the end, they were wrong. The Miami Boys doubled down. Within months, their drug markets were back up and running. Their lieutenants replaced fallen leaders almost immediately. For every victory in court, there seemed to be another battle in the streets. Police began describing the conflict as a war of attrition. The goal was not just to make arrests, but to wear down the gang's infrastructure, cutting off supply chains, seizing money, and removing leaders one by one. Nowhere was the war more intense than in Montgomery, Alabama. By 1991, the Miami Boys had taken over several housing projects, turning them into fortified drug zones. Residents lived in fear. Gunfire was a nightly occurrence. When police launched raids, they were often met with heavy resistance. In one infamous 1992 raid, officers were forced to retreat under automatic gunfire before regrouping with SWAT backup. The Miami Boys treated Montgomery like conquered territory, but law enforcement was determined to take it back. By 1993, the federal government had shifted its strategy. Rather than fighting the Miami Boys street by street, prosecutors built sweeping RICO cases. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover buys revealed the inner workings of the gang. Indictments targeted not just street dealers, but mid-level lieutenants and leaders who coordinated shipments from Miami. One by one, high-ranking members of the Miami Boys were taken off the streets. The sentences were brutal: 20 years, 30 years, even life in prison. The federal government wanted to send a message. The Miami Boys were not just a gang. They were an organized crime syndicate. By 1995, the Miami Boys were a shadow of their former selves. Constant raids, federal indictments, and violent infighting had weakened the once-feared syndicate. In Atlanta, their strongholds in neighborhoods like Bankhead and the Old Fourth Ward were dismantled. In Montgomery and Birmingham, federal cases wiped out entire Miami Boys crews. Meanwhile, new national gangs, the Gangster Disciples, Vice Lords, and Bloods Crips, moved into the vacuum, claiming territory once dominated by the Miami Boys. The war was over. Law enforcement had won. The war between the Miami boys and law enforcement left behind scars that went far beyond arrests and convictions. For police departments, it was a wake-up call, forcing them to adapt to a new era of paramilitary drug gangs. For communities, it was a period of trauma, where entire neighborhoods were caught between the violence of drug dealers and the heavy-handed tactics of law enforcement. The so-called war was not just a battle between cops and criminals. It was a battle for the soul of America's inner cities during the crack era. The story of the Miami boys versus law enforcement is a story of escalation, a story of how a street gang armed with military firepower forced police to adopt military tactics of their own. A story of how an urban drug war claimed lives, destroyed communities, and reshaped the relationship between law enforcement and the people they were sworn to protect.